We're talking about going back to a standard of living that you and I grew up in, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was a lot lower than it is today. But as I remember, I didn't want for too much. I mean, life was pretty good. And I'm not saying everything is going to be great. There's obviously going to be lots of problems, but so much of it has to do with what can I learn to be satisfied with.
I would like to welcome back to the show Art Berman. Art is a friend, a colleague, a petroleum geologist with over 40 years working in the petroleum industry. Today we talk about the expansion of the BRICS nations and how Saudi Arabia and Russia account for a large amount of global export capacity of oil. We talk about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Is that a big deal? Is that a good decision to be drawing it down? We talk about the state of the world oil supply and the United States shale plays, including the Permian and decline rates, and how shale exists all over the world, but the United States situation is special, and that we probably won't access much of the rest of the world's shale. As usual, Art is honest and insightful, and this was a great conversation. I expect to have him back every few months because oil, as Art says, is the economy, at least for now. Please welcome Art Berman. Senor Petrolio, Art Berman, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, always, Nate.
I think we should probably have you every 3 months or so to give an overview on oil, energy, and interesting things. Guests or viewers probably don't know, but you and I have lots of discussions in the background and texts and complaining and opining and questioning each other on various things. So you haven't been on the show in a while. We have lots of energy related topics in the world. Since I've been traveling, I have very few episodes in the cookie jar, and I called you up yesterday. Let's do a podcast. So here we are.
Here we are.
I would like to do an overview of 3 things. One, have you give us an update on what's going on with the world oil situation with this new additional countries to BRICS, Russia, etc. Also, a second thing I'd like to talk about is the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has been getting a lot of news in the United States. How critical is that? What's going on? What's the history? And then third, can you give us a depletion update? What's going on in the shale basin and what does peak oil and peak cheap oil and the next decade or so look like from the perspective of geology? And then Lizzie pointed out to me that although you've been on the show 3 or 4 times, since your first appearance was over a year ago, before I had this format, I've never asked you the closing questions that I ask all my guests, so we'll try to make time for that today. Let's get into it. What's going on in the world? Oil was down $4 a barrel today, but it's been close to $90 the last month or so. Give us an overview.
Well, so today I think oil's just following general markets lower. I mean, we've had some sell-offs in equity markets and God knows what, but I don't want to get bogged down in the details of oil because it's only interesting to people that are bogged down in it to begin with. The big picture on oil is that we are in a situation of enforced scarcity, that OPEC and its friends and neighbors called OPEC Plus, that mostly includes Russia and a few others, have systematically removed pretty nearly 4 million barrels a day of crude oil and a few other products from the market over the last 12 or 13 months. And that's a pretty big chunk.
So it's enforced. So this is not geological depletion. This is their choice for economic or geopolitical reasons to constrain their exports and production.
Well, yes, and it's a little bit of both. So, in other words, what they're doing is they're choosing to accentuate a supply problem that would not be very great at the moment were it not for them making it a very great problem. So they're accelerating a problem which is pretty much inevitable, and the problem is as simple as demand is recovering or has recovered back to pre COVID levels, and supply has not. And so they're making sure that supply absolutely cannot and will not by removing, 4% of world export product from the market. And that does a lot in any commodity market for sure.
Is it 4% of the exports or 4% of the total production?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is we don't know, but they say they're scaling back production. But what that translates to is some factor times their production that equals exports. And since those are big time exporting countries, it works out to be, maybe it's not 4 million barrels, maybe it's, 2.8 or 3.2. I don't know. Nobody really knows. We can measure the seaborne cargoes. We can't really monitor the pipeline stuff very well. And these days, the complexities, particularly of getting Russian oil to points other than Russia, is beyond anyone's ability to extricate. I mean, they're transferring from tanker to tanker. I mean, it's a mess, but it's working for them. It's not working for us.
So, with the help of our friend Pedro Prieto, I made a chart showing the difference between world oil production, of
Right.
which the United States is one of the top three countries, and world oil exports, which is how much is available to purchase after a nation's internal consumption is used. And the United States isn't even on that chart. And with the addition of Iran and Brazil and UAE, along with Russia and Saudi Arabia, the BRICS, or what's being called BRICS plus nations, now account for over 50% of what's available to purchase in the global oil market. Is this just for economic reasons, or is this also having to do with geopolitics, the petrodollar, the relationships between these political nations? Well, what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, it's all of the above, and just a bit of credit to our former colleague Jeffrey Brown and his land export philosophy or
Right.
theory way back, gosh, 2006, 2007. I mean, he was pounding the table about precisely what you just described, and Pedro helped you with way back then,
Hmm.
and only a few people were paying attention. And his point was, gee, as exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, become developed countries, they're not going to have nearly as much oil to export because they're going to use a lot more of it internally. And that's going to be a big problem for those of us who import a lot of oil. That's it's going to be, I mean, who's got enough cash to pay the price of what's left? And the answer for Jeffrey way back when was, well, probably not the United States, probably China or somebody else. And we don't have to hold him to account for those decade old predictions. But he was notionally dead on.
But this is a challenge for a lot of places in the world that are unable to print their own currency, and they're also having to exchange whatever currency they have to buy US dollars to buy oil, hence the petrodollar. Do you see any possibility of a alternative oil-backed currency emanating from BRICS, or is it too small and not powerful enough to make that happen?
Well, I'm certainly not a monetary expert, although I do understand and talk about its relationship to oil. My sense is that it is happening. It will happen. I think it's going to happen a lot slower than some of the people that are making a lot of noise about it. And for the listeners who have not yet listened to your brilliant discussion with Luke Grauman that I think just was released today. There's a lot of good discussion in there about some of the reasons, and many of those reasons have to do with just how much U.S. debt is out there in the world versus how much debt can China, for instance, muster, and that's just one factor. You guys talk about gold, and that's another one. But bottom line is, that's where we're going. I mean, and so we can split hairs about, well, is that going to be important in 5 years or 10 years? I don't know, but that's where we're going, and it is important, and it will become increasingly so.
So what you're saying is we have 4 million barrels removed from global supply because Russia, Saudi Arabia, and some other countries decided to close the taps. Um, so without that, if they would have had the taps open, we would have significantly lower oil prices.
That's yeah. It's almost hard to see a different outcome. And so the question that you're really asking, or that you asked before, was, well, why are they doing this? And the currency piece is certainly important, but I think there's kind of a broader perspective that we have to take, and that is, what is the future of oil, at least in the popular mind? I mean, I think people like you and I believe, for better or worse, maybe more for worse than better, that oil is going to be with us a lot longer than many people think it will be, hope it will be. And I think that includes us too, if I can speak for you on that. But yeah, we're not getting off of oil anytime very soon, if really ever. But that's kind of that's sort of a philosophical or futuristic, I guess, kind of thing to talk about. What's real out there is the perception in the investment community and in the public as well, that oil has kind of a limited future. Or if it doesn't have a limited future, it has come close to reaching the end of its investable future. And so what happens is, when oil prices cycle like they have, you know, pick a time, but any time over the last 5 years, but let's talk about the last 6 months. I mean, you read the press, the oil press, and people are cheering. Oh, this is great. Oil is almost at $100. Oh, it's terrible. It's at $70. But that's the kind of thing that makes investors say, I'm staying out of this thing. I mean, that gives me anxiety. I don't know where this thing is going. And when it's good, it's good. But hey, we're investing in long term, and we can't deal with that kind of volatility.
Well, staying away when prices are up or down means that future prices are going to go up a lot because we're
Right.
not investing in the upstream capacity.
That was exactly where I was going to go. So you have a problem, which is some scarcity, whether it's natural, enforced, or even perceived. And then, because of the way that financialized, which is to say, futures markets, for the most part, not exclusively, the way they kind of accelerate or accentuate how quickly prices can move, then you get an anxiety level that starts to be built in, and investors say, well, we're kind of scared to make the longer term investments that are needed to get rid of the scarcity that we've got, and that tends to accentuate the scarcity, which, as you then point out, ultimately leads to higher prices in a perfect world.
So let me level set here. Please correct my rough interpretation. Most or all of the growth in oil production in the last 13 years since the end of the great financial crisis was the U.S. shale and tar sands. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. That's it.
So the last 13 years, the rest of the world, all the other countries have been flat.
Well,
And a lot of them have been declining because some of them have been increasing.
net flat. Okay. I mean, some countries go up a little bit.
Net flat.
Yeah, net flat. The only discernible growth trend is in North America, and Mexico is not part of that. So it's Canada and the United States, and that's been the case pretty much since 2010. So you're right. It's been 13 years or so.
Well, well, Mexico is part of North America, but they're not part of growing oil production because they're in permanent decline after Cantarell, et cetera.
Well, and they call the rest of us Norteamericanos, so they don't consider themselves part of North America.
Is that right?
That's true. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, but NAFTA still exists. We consider them part of North America, yes?
We consider them part of North America. They consider us somebody who they'll sign a contract with great mistrust because of the way that they feel like they've been treated by los norteamericanos. But that's a cultural thing.
Well, you live close to a border with that country,
Right.
and I'm on the other end. I have a border with Canada. So, all right. So, given that with the United States, this is what really worries me
Mhm.
in this domain. I have plenty of worries in other domains. The U.S. used to have a very good relationship with Saudi Arabia, and obviously, if you look at the oil triangle, a 600-mile triangle, like 2/3 of the world's remaining oil reserves is there.
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia, Iran, et cetera. And now, the shaking the hands and the fist bump with Biden and MBS, and now Russia and Saudi Arabia are getting closer. Saudi Arabia and China are getting closer. If anything that trips this up could massively change the amount of oil on the global export market available to the global north and west. This didn't used to be the case. It was always like there was an oil bank account in the Middle East. And that seems incredibly tenuous to me now. Depletion aside, just looking at geopolitics, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I hate to rag on on people and things, but since you asked the question, I mean, the United States has so thoroughly bungled foreign policy uh, since, well, I'll give Clinton a break, although he kind of goes both ways, but really since the first President Bush, and so let's just step back briefly into the mists of history, and recall that President Roosevelt, on his way back to the U.S. from Yalta, made a stop on an aircraft carrier in the Suez Canal to meet with the King of Saudi Arabia to create a security agreement whereby the United States would guarantee the security of Saudi Arabia. Now, this was 1945. The state of Saudi Arabia was only 12 or 13 years old at this time. So, really tenuous kind of situation. The United States will guarantee the sovereignty of Saudi Arabia if Saudi Arabia will guarantee a future supply of oil to the United States and its allies, and therefore the New World Order, which was being written in places like Yalta by Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin and others. And that was absolutely the centerpiece of American foreign policy from 1945 until the younger Bush decided to screw it up by invading Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, recall his father, the first Bush, did kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and then stopped. And he stopped for a very good reason, and that was he wanted to honor America's principal guiding philosophy in foreign policy, which was don't screw things up in the Middle East. And by not only invading but occupying Iraq and Afghanistan, the younger Bush thoroughly screwed things up, completely changed the balance of power, gave huge power to Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran have hated each other, since the son-in-law of Mohammed, wasn't chosen to succeed him, and that's a whole nother thing. And then comes along Obama, who decided that we don't need Saudi Arabia because we got shale. He listened to all the wrong voices in the room, as Bush did on foreign policy. We don't really need shale, and what we need is Saudi Arabia. What we need is to get into a better relationship with Iran, which of course is Saudi Arabia's arch enemy. So immediately Saudi Arabia was completely pissed with Obama and the United States. Obama also decided, it really wasn't worth supporting Israel because what's Israel got to offer us? So, he just cut the cord on our traditional allies in the Middle East in favor of, and, I'm not saying he was right or wrong. I'm just telling you, well, I did say he bungled it, but, but I mean, this is what happened. And so, Trump comes into office. And, let's give him credit for making Saudi Arabia the first foreign stop he made as a president. But let's think about what he was doing there. What he was doing there was he wanted to woo the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who in his Vision 2030 was planning all kinds of sports events, okay, in which now he's buying golf leagues and soccer leagues, and Trump wanted in on that game. He wanted, he's a hotel kind of guy, right? And so he was there, in my opinion, for, as usual, a lot of the wrong reasons. He didn't have any comprehension of oil particularly, and so. And so we've got this really rocky relationship. Trump is trying to do something in a weird way. Then Saudi, they get their main refinery center blown up, presumably by Yemeni rebels backed by Iran or whatever, and nobody from the State Department even calls and says, "Geez, we feel your pain, man. Just ignore it." I mean, it's like a bit of death in the family. So Saudi Arabia has at least 20 years of reasons to think, man, you guys in America, you suck. You have not been our friend. You have not had our backs. And yeah, we're glad to buy weapons from you and stuff like that, but we're kind of looking elsewhere. So that's the state of affairs, to answer your question in not a very simple or short way, but that's the simple answer as I see it.
Well, there's nothing simple, but there's lots of things perilous about our global energy and geopolitical situation. You just described Saudi Arabia and their mistrust and fraying of relationship with the United States. I let you in on a little secret. Russia is not all that enamored of the United States at the moment.
No.
And between the two of them, it's 42% of world oil exports between those two countries.
Well, you're precisely right. Yeah.
I think they're, yeah, and this is a huge risk that we just assume that there is a global market for things and global cooperation and fungibility and letters of credit and overnight supply chains will always exist if there's a profit, but there's a geopolitical trust is probably depleting faster than oil is. And it's a real thing, Art.
Well, it's not only a thing, Nate, but let's think for just a moment about, I mean, I just described, to use your term, the energy blindness of 3 or 4 American presidents. And by the way, Biden is absolutely, following in Obama's flawed foreign policy footsteps. So this, my criticisms are not political at all here. I mean, we could talk about that in a different time, but I'm just
I
talking
know.
about how four American presidents have completely failed to grasp the central importance of energy, not just because it's important, but as the core of American foreign policy as it was set out by Franklin Roosevelt and fully understood by every president, even, the evil Nixon. I mean, they all got it, and then somehow we forgot it. Now, to your point though about Russia and where I'm going here, if anyone for a moment thinks that the leaders of Saudi Arabia are energy blind, I got news for you. I mean, energy is their gig. I mean, that's what they do. They they may not always make the right decisions, but it's not for lack of knowledge and information. And Vladimir Putin, as we have discussed, I think on this channel once before, I
Hmm.
mean, this guy has, I don't know if it's a PhD, it's different in Russia, but he has a degree in resource economics. He wrote his dissertation or his thesis or whatever you want to call it on basically how the Soviet Union fell for failure to understand its energy infrastructure requirements. And, people will say, oh, well, he didn't really write it. And it was a crappy I don't care. The guy knows a lot more about energy than four American presidents put together, and his counterpart in Saudi Arabia does too.
I mean, the real squeeze in the near term isn't even the United States because what are we consuming? 20 million barrels and producing 18 all in or something like that
Well,
right now?
20 million barrels of products. We're producing something, pretty close to 13 million barrels of crude oil and condensate. And we don't want to get into the sleight of hand that you and
Yeah,
I've
yeah. The
discussed
green
before.
paint.
The green
Right,
paint, right,
right.
right, right. But yeah,
So we're still a significant importer if you net everything out.
and we're a significant exporter of products. So let's not forget that either. And we
Right.
do export, we're exporting something like 4 million barrels a day of crude oil on top of all that. But yeah, net, we are a consumer. We're not a net exporter.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. On oil, but on gas, coal, and oil combined, we're at the near the highest point of energy independence in quite a while, like around 90%, which is much better than Europe, which doesn't have the shale revolution that we had. Real quickly on that, you and I talked a few weeks ago. There are shale deposits
Mm.
in Europe,
Hmm.
which people who are worried about oil, peak oil and oil depletion in the future are pointing out, yeah, we'll develop those. But didn't you tell me that a lot of those are like right underneath Paris or in a heavy population areas and therefore won't be able to be drilled? Can you give a quick FYI on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of shale in the world. Um, but the only shale that counts is marine shale. Okay, shale that was deposited in the ocean. So right away, you can take, I don't know what the number is, but let's just say for argument's sake, half. You take half and throw it away because it doesn't have the necessary organic components to make oil, or really very much natural gas. You say, well, how much of what's left is actually at the right burial depth to cook it, into mature oil, and you can throw away something like another half. And then of all of that, how much is in a place where you can actually get to it commercially, or like you say, what if it's under the city of Paris or, under, the Grand Canyon, or, I mean, so there's a whole lot of areas that get excluded. And in Europe, you've got a pretty high population density. People usually don't like to see oil rigs or coal mines in their backyards. And then you factor in on top of that the United States and maybe Argentina and Canada are some of the only countries in the world that have private ownership of mineral rights. And so there's absolutely no benefit to a citizen living in, let's just say France, since you brought up Paris, he doesn't get a thing if somebody drills an oil well on his property. He just gets the damage of, having to deal with the roads and the mud and and all of that. So there's no incentive for people to say, well, this kind of sucks, but at least I'm going to make some money. So you start adding it up and
Unless it's force majeure and the government just
right.
comes in and says, sorry, buddy, we need the energy.
Right. Well, that's certainly possible. But the point is that, geologically, there are lots of reasons why there's still only a fraction of the shale in the world that's really worth going for. The United States got real lucky. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East got lucky on conventional oil. The United States and Canada got lucky on unconventional oil. There's no good reason for it. It just is. But no. So the idea that everybody can do what we've done in the United States it's just not true.
Here's a question, just because I'm curious. I don't expect you to have the answer, but when the oil was formed,
Mm-hmm.
was that, or at least some of the oil, was Gondwana land together, or like were the continents different and the oceans different when oil was formed? And you said the U.S. and Canada got lucky. I mean, it's a newer province, but where the oil is found was ancient oceans. So when the oil was initially laid down as dead phytoplankton and algae and such in the oceans, were the continents much different? I mean, it wasn't Asia and North America then, was it?
Well, okay, so geological history is long, right? So I think I've told you this before. Ask a geologist almost any question, the answer is it depends. So if we're talking about, 400 million years ago, well, yeah, the continents were kind of all together. If we're talking about most of the oil, or the source rocks that have generated the oil today in North America, most of those were laid down during the Jurassic, which was, the period of dinosaurs, if you will. And by then, the Atlantic Ocean had opened up, and a lot of the source rocks were laid down. And this gets back to some of your discussions with ocean scientists in waters that became stratified and effectively, dead to life, lack of circulation, the kind of thing that's starting to happen in the world oceans today. That's an awesome place to lay down source rocks. It's a terrible place for anything other than algae to live. But so in the Jurassic in North America, we had, and parts of the Cretaceous, tremendous areas where there was just this nasty, stinking black muck that was accumulating on the bottom of the ocean. That made the source rocks. That was good for oil. Didn't happen everywhere.
So the stratified oceans and the death of hundreds of millions of years ago enabled the energy surplus that fuels Las Vegas junkets and smorgasbords today.
That's what makes good source rock. Lots of death, lots of things dying. and algae have this
Yeah.
awesome ability just to consume oxygen like crazy, right? I mean, that's what they do. So yeah, it's not a pretty story. You wouldn't want to go to a beach resort during the Jurassic. Probably not a good suggestion.
So I don't think you can see this per se, but this is from an ancient ocean. This is actually 2 billion years old.
Wow.
These are cyanobacteria fossilized in jasper. It's called Mary Ellen jasper, and it's a stromatolite.
Right.
These little stacks are where the cyanobacteria moved up towards the light and did photosynthesis. These things were alive 2 billion years ago. I get them wet because then I can see them better. Anyways, so
and you
all
would
right,
not you would not
I
have
want to
want,
get to the SP.
you would not have wanted to be on the beach that those stromatolites were living on. It would stink to high heaven and be toxic as hell.
Well, I wouldn't have been able to live, I don't think. We
No,
didn't have an oxygen environment
no,
then.
that's true. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
right. So I want to get to the SPR, but maybe since you brought up shale, where is the peak discussion? Not that I care about the peak, but the peak so far in global oil was, to my knowledge, fourth quarter of 2018, and we've almost hit it again. And a lot of the shale plays in the United States are in permanent decline now, except for the Permian, which is a monster
Hmm.
and keeps increasing. And some people say there may be decades more growth in the Permian. Can you give us a little sense of how all that fits together?
Yeah, sure. So you're absolutely right. The Permian is a monster. Saudi Arabia is a monster. This is just the luck of the draw, I suppose. But the Permian. So there's two cases here. There's the geological case, which is sort of the upside, which is to say that there very likely could be. Let's just be conservative and say, let's say there's at least a decade of plenty of more oil in the Permian. That's the good news. The bad news is well, yeah, but where's the money? Where are the credit markets, the capital supply that's needed to fund that investment? And the answer is they're nowhere to be found. And you add into that the fact that investors have told these companies, and today a lot of the big operators in the Permian Basin are familiar names like ExxonMobil and Chevron and Occidental. I mean, big oil companies, and there are others too. I'm not excluding anyone. And their investors have said, hey, we want returns. We don't want this growth thing anymore. And so even if there were more money available to invest, investors are saying, give it to us. We don't want you to spend it on exploration and development. And so if you take that lens, which is the, really a much more, get back to your force majeure kind of thing. I mean, I suppose the government eventually could come in and say, we're not going to have any more of this. We're going to be drilling like crazy here, but that's not where we are today. And so my sense of it is that geologically we're reaching kind of a plateau. Okay, I mean, I did a study that I think you saw a bit of back in the early part of this year, which says that the average new well in the Permian is maybe 15 or 20% not as good as one back in 2017, 2018. So that sounds pretty bad, but then you start looking at the economics of it and say, holy cow, I mean, you can make a ton of money on a well that's only 15% less good than something in 2018. So my point there, Nate, is there's plenty of
with
money.
with oil at $80 or $90.
Well, actually, the break even that I calculated, and this was, all costs in and like an 8 or 10% return, a discount rate. Those break even prices were, in the mid to upper $40 range. So no, I mean, so that's why these shale companies are making money hand over fist right now at $80 oil, because at least based on the way I calculated their costs, let's just say it's 50. I mean, they're making $30 a barrel. That's pretty darn good.
So let me take a side tangent there and involve the climate discussion.
Hmm.
There is large pushback, and admittedly from a systems blind perspective, but there's huge pushback that the vacillations of oil price, when oil price is high, some of these companies are making egregious profits. And personally, I think that's similar to Intel or Home Depot or other places making profits. It just so happens to be the hemoglobin of our modern life that these companies are extracting and refining and selling. But do you have thoughts on that? I mean, how do we go from a year in 2020 when oil was negative $30 a barrel briefly, and if it costs you $50 a barrel to get it out of the ground, obviously you are in a world of pain, to then the flip side when there's some scarcity and Saudi Arabia and Russia turn off the spigot, and that raises oil prices and therefore profits for companies. What is your sense on that? Because the environmental pushback seems to be growing.
I think you're right in what you said, and that is that we have learned to hate oil companies, and I'm not going to get into whether they deserve it or not, but that's just a fact. And because it's so present in our lives. I mean, every time we go to fill up our car with gas or diesel, we're painfully aware of what it costs. But oil companies are no better or worse, really, than any other kind of corporation that's in it for the money, right? I mean, that's the system we've got. It's not a question of whether I agree with it or not. Nobody asks my opinion. That's the way capitalism works, and we have to remember, in fairness, that I mean the oil companies they've had a decade before all those higher prices of terrible prices when they were losing money. And, so uh, I'm not an apologist for the oil industry, but since I've worked in it, I'm here to tell you it's a tough business, to survive in, both as a company and as an employee. It's not an easy place to be. And I'm not asking anybody to feel sorry for the oil companies. I'm just asking, like you say, think of, Home Depot or Intel. I mean, they have bad years, they have good years, and they need the good years to make up for the bad years. It's just that simple.
So getting back to, I agree with you. Getting back to the best case, so the geology, the
Hmm.
decline rate. And by the way, have you updated your US decline rate of the majority of production? I've been using one of your charts showing like a 35 to 40% decline rate if we stood still. Is that still valid?
It is. I just recently did that, and and this is again for all wells. Not just shale. Every stinking well that's drilled in the state of. I took the five or six biggest producing areas in the country that include Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, North Dakota, Gulf of Mexico, New Mexico, and those account for like 85% of all U.S. production. When I did the decline on that, I came up with 36%. And that's a production weighted decline. So that's not a simple average of all those states. So, that's the number, and that's not hugely different than before. So, yeah, so all production is falling off a cliff if you don't drill a ton of wells to replace the oil that's being used.
So we have four components, not to get overly complicated.
Hmm.
We have the decline of our legacy wells, all the wells that were drilled before today.
Hmm.
If that's all we had, and that was at 100, it would decline by 36% in the next year.
Hmm.
Then the second component is we have new wells that we're drilling and adding that to this declining amount. And then we have global exports, which we can pay money for and buy other people's oil.
Hmm.
And then the fourth thing is, on top of all those three, we have the Strategic Petroleum Emergency Oil Bank Account, which we can draw from and supplement those other three. Is that a correct summation?
You nailed it. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so what is the best case in your view? Best case on geology and technology, assuming there are no credit disasters and that growth continues and that we don't have a nuclear war with NATO and Russia and that we have international cooperation with all the relevant countries. What is the peak oil update, as it were?
I think that we are at a point where decline is the only thing that I see out there, and we can argue about it. I actually made a forecast that I shared with you, and it's kind of similar to one of BP's cases. I didn't copy them, but one of the BP cases, has oil production declining, like 20-25% over the next 15 or 20 years. It's not as extreme as the net zero roadmap, which isn't meant to be a projection by the IEA. It's less optimistic than the U.S. EIA's kind of business as usual forecast. Yeah, and that's not to say that we won't reach a new peak temporarily, but the big picture long term is that we're just not going to have the supply, which doesn't mean that it isn't there to be developed. We're just not going to have it available to us because of this some combination of geology, lack of investment, etc. And then you bring in this angle of higher oil prices, and I mean that's ultimately what kills not only oil demand but economic activity and economic growth. And so at some point you get to a price where can you and I just say, geez, I'm going to leave the truck in the garage today. you know, I don't need to go out all that much, and so we start cutting back, and that has a ripple effect first through the oil market, but eventually, since oil pretty much is the economy, or at least GDP and oil correlate as perfectly as you'd ever want to have two things correlate. At some point, you start using less energy, and oil is the master energy resource, at least for now. The economic activity of the world is going to go down, and then price goes down, and et cetera, et cetera. And those are the kinds of things that, I mean, and again, this is ignoring the catastrophe scenarios you just mentioned. But these things happen; they're real, and we only have to go back to the 1980s. I mean, oil prices were as high as they'd ever been in 1980. Oil was something like $120 a barrel in today's dollars, and demand just cratered. And we had 13 years of super low oil prices. And that was one of the main components of Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker's success story, Reaganomics and all that. They didn't have high oil prices to deal with. Now, the flip side of that is all the developing countries in the world, like South America and Africa, that were saddled with U.S. commercial bank debt, that were in a damn depression. I mean, that's why demand went down so much. And so, again, talking about interest rates and the things that are going on in the financial world right now, we're not going to repeat the 1970s and 80s. Don't get me wrong. I don't believe in that kind of stuff, but we are absolutely set up for triggering a real depression in a lot of debt-saddled countries outside of the United States and Europe, and that's gonna really hurt demand for oil and therefore the global economy.
Peak demand.
Well, for a lot of reasons, yeah, it's not peak demand because people are sick of oil and they all they want to buy a Tesla. It's because they just can't afford what they need.
So, what I love about our conversations is, even though we know each other quite well and we compare notes and ideas, you always lead me to asking questions that I didn't anticipate to ask. So here are two. I wonder, because of, like you said, the relationship between oil and the economy, economic growth is incredibly tightly linked. You have a chart, it's like 0.97 R squared or something,
Right.
globally. That and the fact that a barrel of oil does, depending on the handicap for efficiency, 4 or 5 years of our labor. So we have between 300 and 500 billion fossil workers added. As we raise the cost of those, there is a leveraged multiplier effect on our productivity, and that ends up leading to recession or depression, as you point out. But also, what's happening now is we have become dependent on artificially low interest rates,
Mm.
which also have a leverage multiplier in the economy. And interest rates have just had their largest, like, 6 month increase, like in history. The 10-year note is approaching 5%.
Hmm.
And that also has a ripple effect on demand. Today, the average national mortgage rate is approaching 8%.
Right.
So you've got high oil prices and higher interest rates. These are the two things that really impact Jill and Joe Sixpack's ability to drive and consume. And I don't, with 33 trillion in debt and interest rates going up, where we're going to have to spend over $1 trillion on debt, I don't see a way out of this other than some sort of stagflation. Do you have any thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I mean, I made a slide that I sent to you that I think its title is something like "High Oil Prices Are the Silent Killer of Economic Activity." And I don't say that it's not a tagline that just sort of sounds good. It's an empirical observation from 40 some odd years of doing this kind of work and looking back and saying, well, has this ever happened before? I mean, can we go back in history and find real examples where this occurred? And I just cited one. I mean, 13 years of most of the world, or a lot of the world, being in economic recession in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean, that's pretty terrible. And there, it's complicated. It's not just high energy prices, but high energy prices are the dominant factor and were the trigger. And it's just that simple.
And if that happens again, that we go into a global recession or depression, and oil, despite it being incredibly valuable,
Hmm.
is down to $10 or $20 a barrel again, then that will be also a feedback that
Hmm.
keeps companies from investing in more production, meaning it will accentuate the decline rate, ceteris paribus. Yes?
Totally. So when oil prices got super high back in the 1970s and the very earliest part of the 1980s, companies went and did a lot of expensive exploration in places like the North Sea, in Alaska, in Mexico, in Siberia, places that they knew about forever, but would not have gone there at lower oil prices. They discovered a whole bunch of oil. We had a glut of oil, sort of like we did with the shales when they came in, in the first part of this century. And so not only did we have a global recession, at least in developing countries, but we had an oversupply. Okay, that made oil prices low for 13 years or so. And so what kind of things did companies go and look for after that? Well, they had to be monsters. You had to go find elephants, giant fields. Where were those? 5,000 feet of water, 6,000 feet of water. That's where all the exploration was. There were no more, Alaskas. There were no more Siberias or Mexicos. Those had been found. And then the shales came along because oil prices got high again. So the question is, where do we go next? What's the next geology or technology that works us out of the scarcity cycle that I described in the beginning of this conversation? And we don't know, but the hope among many people, including those who want to get off oil, is that it's renewables. and
Or the Arctic?
Oh, well, yeah, good luck with that. But yeah, there are lots of possibilities, but not with low oil prices. I mean, so that's the question you just raised is, okay, so if we crater oil prices, then what's out there for us? And the answer is it better be renewables, because it ain't going to be geology. At least
Well,
not that I know
the answer that you and I think and have come to the conclusion is less energy
Sure.
consumption
Absolutely.
is the
That
answer.
is the answer. It's
And
not
the
an
other thing is interest rates. Go ahead, Art.
it's not an answer anybody likes, and people criticize, say, well, no one's going to do that voluntarily, and geez, I never thought about that. Yeah, of course we're not going to do that
You're
voluntarily.
right. No, I know. So the other thing with interest rates, though, is interest is the largest expense for many renewable projects. So
Right.
when we moved from 1% to almost 5% on 10-year notes, this has a major dent in the affordability of scaling renewable energy unless things change with financing, et cetera.
But there's a parable that we need to remember, and that is shale and renewables. I mean, they couldn't be more different in some ways. But if we go back 10 or 13 years and look at shale, it was all about growth. Investors were piling into shale because there were huge multiples, and they could make a lot of money on the stock, and they didn't care so much about whether these companies were profitable until they did, and then they all went away from the shales. Well, renewables is right there right now. It's all about the growth and not about the returns, and that's just fine with investors until it won't be. There'll come a time when the renewables are going to reach the same day of reckoning that the shales did. And investors are going to say, well, where are the returns, guys? And then the multiples go down. And so, I mean, this is sort of the logic that I go through when I say that lower energy consumption is inevitable. I mean, if the next greatest thing is going to possibly repeat the same cycle as the last greatest thing, then we're talking about a decade or so, and we're going to be out of answers again.
Let me put you on the spot, Signor Petrolio. And if you don't want to answer this, we'll just skip it and get to the SPR. But the conclusion, which to many of the followers of this podcast is obvious, that lower material throughput is an inevitable reality that could happen much sooner than we think, but it's coming in the coming decades for the United States and for the world related to energy. But most of the global authorities and experts and international organizations who are considered the foremost go-to places on this data, the World Economic Outlook, the International Energy Agency, the Energy Information Agency, couldn't, even if they believed it, could they really say there's going to be less and less energy and oil available? Or do they have to, for political status, glass ceiling reasons, somehow obfuscate the story with peak demand or net zero narratives that embed this decline in a different sort of story? What do you think about all that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've both had anecdotal experiences over the last couple of months that I think are parallel insofar as, there are a few people out there, political leaders and climate and ecological activists and opinion influencers that understand that, yeah, I mean, all this net zero stuff is probably not going to work so well, and renewables are probably not going to work the way some people hope, but we got to keep telling people that. But I have to say that the most people, they really believe this stuff. I mean, whether they're policymakers or whether they're climate scientists or whether they're transportation engineers. I mean, they truly believe it. And I mean, I just gave a couple of talks a few weeks ago where I pissed more people off than I think I have in 10 or 15 years back when I was giving the shale talks. I
And
mean,
that's saying a lot.
yeah, I've been really trying to be a good boy and not piss people off. But, basically
Why?
why am I doing that? Well, because
No, no,
I'm,
no. Why did you piss them off? What did
oh,
you say?
I told them that all these, these climate solutions were simply not going to work. That they needed to understand the human predicament, and that their carbon focus, their climate change focus was a narrow view. That they weren't thinking about the bigger picture. They weren't thinking about the planetary abuse. They weren't thinking about the kinds of things you and I are talking about, like the economy and interest rates and treasury bonds. And I mean, all this matters. And climate scientists, bless their hearts, I mean, I love them to death, but they live in a very in a very limited kind of world. And when somebody who's not one of them, and I'm not, gets up there and says, guys, I mean, this is a noble effort, but everything I see is, this ain't going to work the way you think it is. There are no solutions. They hate that. They hate hearing that. Surely there have to be solutions.
There are responses, not solutions. But the reason I think people like that, and I get similar response in my presentations, believe that is because we've just gone through 50 years of lower and lower interest rates, ubiquitous available of credit,
Hmm.
and growing oil supplies. Uh, I mean, we had a phase shift all the way to the 1970s. We grew at 6% per year, and since then it's been 2% per year or something like that. But it's been growing. So all of our visions of the future are supported by our emotional memory of what the last 50 years were. And those interest rates and those oil prices are not, and the oil amount are not, are going to imply a much different future when they go the other direction. So yeah, I mean, this is why we have to have these conversations, because I don't know what to do. Um, but I think we need a lot more of those climate activists, university professors, politicians, civic leaders, community organizers working on real viable responses, and not pie in the sky ones that aren't going to materialize.
I mean, the environment of abundance that we've been in my business, the one I know the most about, which is oil, when there's optimism about abundance, prices tend to move in the direction of the most efficient operators with the lowest variable cost, which is why we were hearing in the early days of the shale revolution, oh, the break even costs are now only $60 a barrel. No, now they're 50. Now they're 40. Yay. This is great. Well, that's not the world that we're in anymore. Now we're in a world of relative scarcity. And where does price go in that environment? It goes to the very highest level that consumers can bear, and we're no longer interested in the marginal price. We'll go however much higher it goes until consumers say no. And right now, I mean, I think oil prices are about $20 over the marginal price. I'm not saying the market's wrong. I'm saying, well, I'm agreeing with myself. We're way above the marginal cost because we're not playing the abundance game anymore.
A lot of people, like the Singularity Institute, say that we're headed for an era of abundance,
Mm,
and the scarcity mindset is dangerous.
mm.
Um, I've thought about that, and I actually think the answer is a subtle one. We are headed for a global era of scarcity. But as an individual human, you
Mm.
can adopt, train yourself, meditate, change your behaviors so that you personally perceive the world in a way of abundance, even if there is physical scarcity generally. And I think that's an interesting asymptote to aim for. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to go there. It's like a Buddhist economics within a declining capitalist system. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I had that conversation with all sorts of people, a lot of them very young people. In the last two rounds of talks I gave, one was at a climate conference at a university in Texas, and the other was an energy group at a different university in Texas. And for those that stuck around long enough to get past all the cherished belief arguments, that's where we got to is look, we're not talking about life as we know it ending. We're talking about going back to a standard of living that you and I grew up in, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was a lot lower than it is today. But as I remember it, I didn't want for too much. I mean, life was pretty good, and I'm not saying everything is going to be great. There's obviously going to be lots of problems, but so much of it has to do with what can I learn to be satisfied with? Can I learn to be satisfied with what I have, or am I always wanting something more, which more than likely is something I actually don't need? It's as you say, it's something you train yourself in.
So hold that thought because I called you yesterday. Art, let's do a podcast on the SPR. And here we've talked an hour and we haven't mentioned the SPR.
Mm.
But I do want your reflections on advice and advice to young people, et cetera. So take a pause. Tell us, what is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? How did it come about?
Yeah.
How much oil is in there? How much oil have we drawn down? How relevant is that? How accurate are the scare stories out there? I mentioned earlier we have our declining oil, which is declining at 36% per year. Then we have our new drilling, and then we buy extra oil in the world market. But then there's this SBR, and in order to reduce the price at the pump, we've also been pulling oil out of that to reduce the prices. So give us a story about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
The Strategic Petroleum Reserve came into existence in direct response to the first oil shock in late 1973, 1974. This is what's commonly known as the Arab oil embargo in response to the so-called Yom Kippur War. So Israel was attacked by Syria and Egypt, and the Arab countries that had become, most of them, OPEC about 10 or 12 years earlier, said, well, guys, anybody who's supporting our enemy, Israel, we're cutting you off from exports, which they did, and the U.S. was one of them. And there were, it was a horrendous psychological experience, not unlike what we're talking about, Nate. I mean, life didn't end. It's just that people had to wait in line to get gasoline, horror. I don't want to do it either, but it's not like life ends when that happens. But the experience, you can imagine. I mean, this post-war ebullience that we were going through, anything is possible, American can do, etc. And suddenly we're screwed by some people that we don't even know. I mean, who are these guys? Why are they doing this to us? And so in 1975, the Congress passed a law that said, okay, we're going to do two things. We're going to create a national petroleum reserve, and we're going to pour a whole bunch of oil into mostly underground salt caverns so that if this ever happens again, we've got a pretty good supply of our own oil that we can draw on so that we don't get in gasoline lines and et cetera, like we did this time. And the other thing is we are going to ban export of just about every kind of crude oil imaginable. Now, we didn't actually export huge amounts of crude oil back in those days, but we said, look, we just can't afford to do this. We need to keep all our oil in our country. So that was 1975. And so the Strategic Petroleum Reserve mostly just kind of sat there, and most of it, by the way, I mean, it's all over the country, but most of it's in a couple of salt domes here in Texas and Louisiana. And I think I gave you a slide that actually shows a map of that. And So we're looking at something like 700 million barrels. So it's a fair amount of oil. There's no question about it. It's not, it's not enough. Well, I mean, the United States uses 5 billion barrels in a year, just to give you some context. So it's a chunk, but it's not. It's a helper. Let's put it that way. It mostly sat there, and then we got to a point not very long ago, towards the end of 2021, when things started heating up with OPEC, and it looked like probably Russia was going to do something nasty, or maybe not, but in Ukraine. And we're kind of preparing for all of that. And our president, Biden at the time, said, okay, we're going to start releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve so that we don't feel the pain so much. Now, just between you and me and everybody who's listening, I think that was an absolutely terrible idea. I mean, but we'd already given up on banning crude oil export in 2016. And that was an even worse idea, in my opinion. But, which is the worst of two bad ideas? I mean, if you're trying to save yourself for a rainy day, you don't do either of them, right? You can argue about, well, is this the right thing or not? But at least we're doing something. So two terrible ideas: exporting crude oil again. Now, and everybody who works for an oil company say, wait a minute, that was a great idea. I mean, look at all the money we're making. Okay, yeah, it was a great idea for capitalism, a terrible idea for conserving
for
our
our
own.
future.
Yeah, for our future, exactly. So the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, got drawn down from something like 700 million barrels to where it is today, which is about 360 million. And that's 40%. That's a lot. And so, a lot of the critics and the analysts and pundits and anti-Biden kind of people say, "Oh, this is a horrible thing. I mean, look what he's done," and I just said, "Yeah, bad idea." But those are the same people that say, "Well, but it's a great idea to export crude oil." Well, you compare the two numbers, and we've drawn down, like, round numbers, 250 million barrels of Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We've exported 6.5 billion barrels of crude oil since that ban came off in 2017. And I gave you a graph showing the two. And I mean, it's like this SPR thing is insignificant. Again, we shouldn't have done either, but we did. So if you want to complain about something that's really affecting our future, stop the crude oil export, or stop complaining would probably be a better idea. Just accept that this is a done deal, or whatever you like.
Okay, so the SPR is important. It's an insurance policy. The media is blowing it out of proportion a little bit. And if they were not energy blind, they would be focusing on the reality of the United States draining America first, and selling that oil to other countries is a much bigger deal than draining the SPR.
Exactly.
So here's just a naive question. Have you ever been to one of those salt caverns? Have you ever, is it
I've
allowed?
Yeah, I mean, you have to make arrangements, but yeah, you can go visit. It's not very exciting. I mean, it looks like, on the surface, it just looks like a bunch of oil tanks, and you can drive around, and the tanks go down thousands of feet. They had to drill a well and put pipe in it, and it connects to a cavern that's been dissolved out of a giant hunk of salt. They just, force fresh water in there and dissolve it out, and it makes a great place to store oil because it's impermeable, it's large, and it can't get out of the salt and pollute the beds around it or anything else. And they just pump, millions of barrels in, and every once in a while they pump millions of barrels out, and hopefully we'll someday get around to putting back in what we pumped out. But yeah, there's a couple of them that are pretty close to where I live in Houston.
So a savvy practice would be to keep those tapped off all the time, topped off, in case there is an international emergency or whatever. Do other countries, like, does Europe have strategic petroleum reserves like similar?
It does. I mean, the United States is by far the largest in the world, at least as far as we know. We don't really know what China has. They're not very transparent in, their storage or anything like that. But my guess is that China probably has a pretty respectable one. I mean, they are the second economy in the world. They're the largest oil importer, and so and just parenthetically, I mean, we didn't really get to talking too much about the BRICS and all that stuff, but the assumption that that China would do really well from high oil prices, I think is misinformed. I mean, China is a big consumer, and China is going to. I mean, their strategy for years has been to just dump product out on the market when prices get high to lower the prices. So, we're just there's a lot of kind of ideological misconceptions about who's on what side and what their interests are. But as far as strategic petroleum reserves, when Biden decided to do this, it was done in concert with a number of our European allies. And it was a way of, kind of putting a stick in OPEC's eye and saying, okay, you guys want to cut? Guess what? We can pump.
Yeah, but it's the deferring the second marshmallow sort of thing. It's just one of those many choices that we can consume now and pay later.
Right.
Because at some point in the future, not only the oil in the SPR, but the oil in the ground will be incredibly important to our children and beyond.
And it is important to us. We just don't value it the way we should.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, my friend. Thank you for that education on the SPR. If you have a few more minutes, I know you're in grandfather babysit mode, so I want to be respectful of your time. But I never did ask you the closing questions that I've come to ask all of my guests. And I know you listen to this podcast because you often tweet out the day of after you listen to the latest episode.
It's
So,
true.
you have been a macro observer thinking about these issues for a very long time, long before you and I met. What is your personal advice to listeners at this time of converging human predicaments ahead of the great simplification or whatever you might call it? What advice would you have to people listening to this program?
My advice would be to take a breath and don't let yourself get caught up in the kind of anxiety that our media and a lot of our political leaders and certainly even our friends and colleagues want to draw us into. That I'm not here to tell you that everything's going to be great or that everything's going to work out or that life is going to carry on just as it has. In fact, I'm confident that none of those statements will be exactly true. But what I think I've learned and learned from others, not just from my own experience and study, is that things are rarely as bad as they seem, or at the very least, when they seem really bad, that means that everything bad that could happen sort of has to happen simultaneously and in an aggregate way. Now, that doesn't mean that bad things and terrible things don't happen, because occasionally they do. But it's very rare that all of the horrible things that we can imagine might happen will all happen at the same time and will all happen like tomorrow morning. It's like some of these movies. All of a sudden, climate has catastrophically changed tomorrow, and New York City is flooding or freezing or whatever. I mean, those are just not probable outcomes. And so, take a breath, and go talk to a friend or meditate or read a novel or something, and think about all of the trials that people in the past have faced, and somehow, they either lived through them or they adjusted to them. Um, this too will pass in some way, not without pain, but it's probably not as immediate as we all think. Now, lots of bad scenarios could happen, but more likely than not, it's whatever happens, it's going to be how well you take it and adjust to it. I think Darwin, whether he actually said it or not, doesn't matter. It's not about who's the fittest of the species that survives. It's which one is the most adaptable. So be one of those more adaptable, and you may need to learn some things. I certainly need to learn some things. I mean, I don't have this all figured out, but whenever I get a little freaked out, I try to remind myself, settle down for a minute. Remember who I am and where I am, and talk to a friend, read a book. That's what I recommend.
How would you change that advice for young humans listening to this program, 17 to 25 years old?
Well, first of all, I would try not to despair. Um, Try not to see myself and my generation as a target. The world is a tough place, but it's kind of impersonal in the end, and it is true. It's absolutely true that your generation is going to have to bear an awful lot more of the pain of what we're doing right now than my generation or yours, Nate, who are only a little bit younger than I am. That's a fact. I can't make that go away. But I don't think anybody planned this, to cause you or your generation pain. I'd say, I mean, read your paper on the superorganism. This is just, or listen to, some of the many podcasts. This is just the way that human society has evolved. It wants more. It takes more, and there are consequences to all that. It's not a good thing, and I'm not making excuses for it, but don't take it personally. Figure out, okay, this is happening. This is, I can waste a lot of energy wishing it weren't happening, or trying to blame whoever I think it is, and that's the most important thing. Blaming accomplishes absolutely nothing. It may make you feel a little bit better for a moment, but let's just say that the CEOs of 5 oil companies are in fact solely responsible for everything that's happening to our planet. Put them in jail, boil them in oil. I mean, do whatever you want. Did that make you feel better? Maybe, maybe not. Did it help the planet? Not a bit. So it's natural. Okay, I'm flawed. I'm human. I want to, first reaction. Who's to blame? Who can I put my? But it doesn't. It's not helpful. It's just not helpful. What can I do in my little circle of friends and family to somehow make things better with what we have?
Thank you. Do you have any career advice for young humans, given what you know about our biophysical landscape?
I would look beyond the emphasis, the mainstream emphasis of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I mean, that's the direction I went. So I'm maybe not a great person to seek advice from, but there's a whole nother side of life which is more attuned to, as you said a little bit earlier about the metaphysical, things like philosophy, things like religion, and I'm not pushing religion, but things like religion. Just going after all the things of this world, the tangible pieces of this world that we can measure and count and put in a bank account or whatever. That certainly, we need that to survive. But if that's all that there is in life, then I think life is at least for me, it's not really worth living very much. I mean, there is the side of creativity and satisfaction and empathy and compassion that most of us, and I'm speaking from personal experience. I mean, I was I was frozen in some sort of state of emotional underdevelopment. I mean, here I was, 50 or 60 years old, and I had the emotional equipment of a kid in the junior high locker room. And in many ways, I still do. And you criticize me occasionally for some of those behaviors, Nate. But okay, I see that. I'm aware of that, and I'm and so be aware of what's happening, and pick a career that 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 gives you bliss, and ignore all the people that tell you, well, how are you going to make any money doing that? Don't worry about it. I mean, it should be somewhere in your awareness. But if that's really what you want to do, then you should follow that. I mean, I didn't. It took me, I mean, my first degree was in history, for crying out loud. It took me until I was, 10 years out and a father and had done a bunch of odd jobs, and I'm better for it, by the way, to say, I really like the earth. And I don't know why it took me so long to figure it out, and I was told by some very important people, including my parents, you're no good at that. You'll never be any good at that. Well, I'm not saying they were wrong and I'm right. I'm saying I'm sure glad I did it, because I still love what I do every day.
Well, history was at least in the right direction. You just really wanted to study the history of rocks, not people.
The history of everything. That's what I wanted
Yes.
to. I didn't know it.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, what do you care most about in the world, Art?
I care about life, not just my own, although I am selfish. I care about, I'm here being with my grandchildren. My wife's here with me. I care about my family. My dog's here with me. I love her. My daughter's dog is here. I mean, their hamster, all the birds that are outside. I mean, um, we're all we're all together. And that's not just the COVID cliche, we're all in this together. I mean, we all are in life together. That doesn't mean that we all need to, you know, to be working towards a goal. I mean, that's such a, well, that's another conversation altogether. But, we all are here together in this life. And it's a mess in a lot of ways, but it is a beautiful thing. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And some days I have to remind myself just how much I really enjoy. I mean, we were talking on the phone the other day, and I said, Nate, are those ducks in the background?
Yes, they were.
And you put me on FaceTime, and there were those ducks, and they were funny. They made me laugh. They were great. I
They make
mean,
me laugh every day. They make me
so
laugh. No,
again, I don't have this figured out, not even close. But pick something that just really makes you want to learn more about it and do more with it, whatever that is. I wish I'd have done it sooner, but I'm not sorry that I did it the way I did it.
if you were had a magic wand and there was no personal recourse to your decision, what is one thing you would do to improve planetary or human society futures?
I warned you, ask a geologist and you're going to get an "it depends" answer, but I'll give you an optionality answer. How about that? I'll give you a choice. If I'm the king of the world, if I'm the emperor of the universe, I'm going to give you two choices. You have to do one or the other. The first is you need to listen to every single one of the Great Simplification podcasts. And if you don't like that option, then you have to put in an equal number of hours with a psychological therapist. And you're probably not going to want to do either one of those, but those are the two things that I would require if I could, with no recourse, of every citizen. And you're going to fight and you're going to scream like most people do. But because you don't have a choice, you're going to come out of it somehow changed in some way, I hope.
Well, what you're really saying is we need to have broader systems education, and we need to have people healed from trauma and do inner work so that we can live more in the post-tragic instead of the tragic, and both enjoy life and contribute to the collective predicament we face. So I agree with that. I agree with those two categories. My friend, uh, this is your fourth time, I think, with the
So,
roundtable. I would
yeah.
like to continue to have you come back. We've covered a lot of different topics. I wanted to have you on today because of the BRICS and the oil and the SPR. Is there a topic that you are curious about that's relevant to our future that you would like to take a deeper dive on the next time you're on?
Well, since you asked, yeah, there is. I'd like to pursue the topic that I told you got me in a little bit of contentious water just recently, which is the title of the talk I gave was Getting Honest About the Human Predicament, which almost sounds like it could be a Frankly or something. So, you've influenced me a lot. But yeah, let's talk about the what actually is realistic and feasible versus what is just basically, fooling ourselves about where we're going with the ideas, the potential solutions that people talk about for this predicament we're in, which goes beyond climate change. I mean, obviously that's front and center for a number of people, but I know you and your listeners, we're interested in ecology, we're interested in the earth, some of us are really concerned about financial situations, geopolitics. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that kind of all comes together, and we can't cover all that. But I would like to just sit together the next time and talk about, let's explore. Okay, if you think this is a good idea, whatever it is, renewables or net zero or or nuclear or fusion or whatever, let's just play that forward and see what kinds of things we learn when we investigate that path further than just the headline.
Let's do it. Sounds like a plan. 3 months, más o menos. To be continued. I'm sure we will talk soon. Enjoy your time with your grandchildren, and thank
I
you
will.
again for your time and expertise sharing today.
Always a pleasure, Nate. You too.
If you enjoyed or learned from this episode of The Great Simplification, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform and visit thegreatsimplification.com for more information on future releases.